وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, today we will continue our look at some of the aspects of salat, of our prayer, that can allow us to better practice and better benefit from this act of worship that Allah has taught us. We talked yesterday about some of the attributes of the Prophet and our Imams during their prayer, and how it would be something which they would treat as a very unique and a special time in the day. It's not just a matter of going through the motions. It is narrated that our first Imam, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam, when the time for prayer would come and when he would prepare for prayer, his expression, his color of his skin, everything would change. It would be as if he were already all of a sudden in a completely different state from what he was before. And people who observed that change come just in the matter of a few moments when the time for prayer came, they would ask him, why is it that all of a sudden you seem to be now in a state of fear, in a state of concern, your color has changed, the body might be shaking. And the Imam said that the Quran speaks about the amana that Allah presented to the heavens and the earth, that they were given that chance to hold the divine trust, and they refused, and they were afraid to do so. So this is the time for us to give back that amana, to show that we are worthy of that trust, something which heavens and earth were unable to bear, but which humanity is to bear. And our salat is the time when we are expressing to Allah that we are ready for that amanat. And so it is a very weighty thing. It is when we are being audited and when we have to give back to Allah our trust. The prayer, we talked about some of the preparation for it, and now I want to just briefly look at a few of the parts of the prayer which complete our salat. The wajibat of the prayer are not all equal. There are some parts which are especially important. They are known as the arkan, the pillars of the prayer. And out of them, the most important, we can say, are ruku' and sujud, which have been mentioned separately in the Quran. In addition to the general commandment, aqimus salat, we have specific commandments to do ruku' and to do sujud. So we will talk a little bit about those aspects of the prayer. But to begin, our salat begins with the call to prayer. The adhan and then the iqamah, they are how we introduce our prayer. And there is an importance to the adhan and to the iqamah. It is very highly recommended for people that in every prayer we do, we should begin by reciting the adhan, and then it is recommended to give a brief pause, whether it be with a jalsa, a sitting, or a 2 rak'at prayer, or a brief dua, and then to recite the iqamah. So it is kind of a graduated preparation for the salat. I've mentioned before that the requirements for the adhan are somewhat relaxed. When the time for prayer comes, that is when the adhan should be recited. It shouldn't be recited before the time for the prayer has begun. But once the time for prayer has come, whether or not you have done wudu, whether or not you are facing qibla, or you might not even know what the direction of qibla is if you are traveling, if you know that the time for prayer has come, you can recite the adhan. And then you can find out which way is the qibla. You can recite the adhan standing or sitting. So it is recommended to be ready for the prayer ahead of time and to do the adhan standing up facing the qibla with wudu. But the important part for the first call to prayer is to prepare us to be in the mindset and to be ready for the salat, even if we haven't done those preliminary actions yet. And then when it comes to the iqamah, that is now literally establishing the prayer. And so by that time, we should have taken care of all of our other affairs, and we should have wudu, we should be facing the qibla. That is when the iqamah should be done. And it should be done in such a way that as soon as the iqamah is over, we won't need to speak anything else or say anything else, and we can begin the prayer itself. There are certain blessings that are mentioned for a person who prays with adhan and iqamah. The first, and perhaps the most significant for us, is that if you say adhan and iqamah before your prayer, then no prayer that you make will be counted as an individual prayer. It will not be a munfarid prayer, but it will be a jama'ah. Because hadith tell us that if a person recites the iqamah, then there will be one row of angels that will pray behind a person. And as we know in the rules of jama'ah, if any one prayer in the congregation is accepted, then the prayer of all of those in the congregation is accepted. Allah treats it as a single prayer. If we have a row of angels praying behind us, then the prayer of those angels is not going to be rejected, no matter how deficient our own prayer is. So it is not just a matter of having the thawab of jama'ah, but it is also a form of a guarantee that our prayer will be accepted. So that is for a person who does iqamah. For a person who recites the adhan and the iqamah, then there will be two rows of angels praying behind them. And numerous ahadith say that وَحَدُّ الصَّفِّ مَا بَيْنَ الْمَشْرِقِ وَالْمَغْرِبِ, that the definition of a row of angels is as far as the horizons go, between the east and the west. So it is an almost limitless extent of the angels who will pray with a person who does adhan and iqamah. When we hear the adhan, it is very highly recommended to repeat each of the words of the adhan as we hear them, even if we're not in the masjid, even if we might be preparing ourselves, we might be doing wudu, we might be outside. But when you hear the adhan, then to repeat the same words and to say them aloud, that is very highly recommended. The adhan is recommended for both men and for women, but it is more of a high recommendation for men. And for women, if they do the adhan and the iqamah, that is good. But if they are pressed for time, or if they wish to shorten it, then for women it is especially recommended to do takbir and the shahadatan, the two shahadas. So to say Allahu Akbar, to say Ashhadu anna an la ilaha illallah, and Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. That is sufficient in place of reciting the entire adhan and the entire iqamah. And there are benefits to the adhan and the iqamah in addition to the readiness for the salat. A few things that have been mentioned. One is that it is good for a person's character. There is a hadith that if a person has su'ul khulq, if a person's attributes and etiquette are deficient, then recitation of the adhan in front of that person can be a factor in the improvement of a person's manner and etiquette. Two other benefits that have been mentioned for reciting the adhan, and reasons why it is recommended that when we are home, we should call the adhan aloud. Of course, the obvious benefit of calling the adhan aloud is that it is a reminder for anybody else who might have been distracted or might not have been aware of the time for prayer, that it is a time for prayer. It is a gentle reminder, rather than going and knocking on doors and insisting, but just to make that reminder that the time for prayer has come. But several worldly benefits also apply to reciting the adhan in a household where the adhan is called aloud. Number one, if there is a family that wishes to have children and they have difficulty in having children, then one of the recommendations that imams would give is to recite the adhan aloud. And that will be a source for Allah to answer prayers for those who are looking to have children. And also it is considered to be very beneficial for sickness. That if a person is ill, reciting the adhan aloud is good for the sicknesses and the illnesses to be cured. when it comes to adhan and iqamah, all of the prayers are not equal. Many times we think of these ideals, we make a resolution in the masjid that from now on I'm not going to skip the adhan and the iqamah. But then as we go through our lives, we don't always have the presence of mind, we don't always have the time, we don't always have in a word we can say we don't always have the tawfiq from Allah to be able to do what we should do and we should be able to make time for. So if that is ever the case, it is useful for us to know what the priorities are. Which are the most important times to do a certain action so that we can build our practice. The ideal, of course, is to build to doing the adhan and the iqamah for all of our prayers. But if we are not there yet, the most important two prayers are Maghrib and Fajr. For those two prayers, we should do both the adhan and the iqamah whenever possible. And then for Isha, we can pray Isha with an iqamah, and that would be sufficient. If we do adhan for Fajr, then we can pray Dhuhr and Asr with an iqamah alone. It's better to do the adhan as well, but that is sufficient. And there are reasons that have been mentioned in a hadith why that is the case. And the first reason is mentioned that if you do the adhan for Fajr, then Fajr is considered to be the first prayer of the daytime. So you are beginning your daytime with an adhan. And Maghrib is the first prayer of the night, so you are beginning the nighttime also with the adhan. And then another unique factor about Maghrib and Fajr is that these are the two prayers that are not shortened when we are traveling. So Dhuhr, Asr, and Isha, they are 4 rak'at prayers, they have 4 cycles. They are shortened to 2 rak'ats when we are traveling. And because there is a shortening that takes place in those prayers, there is also recognition that some of the nawafil, for example, can also be shortened, or the ta'qibat can also be shortened. But Maghrib and Fajr, they are what they are, whether we are traveling or whether we are home. So just as the prayer itself is important and it is not shortened, the preparation for that prayer, the adhan, should also be given a special importance. And we will see something similar when we talk about the nawafil. The 2 nawafil which we should give the most importance to are also the nawafil of Fajr and the nafilah of Maghrib, out of all of the nawafil that we have in the day. So for the adhan and the iqamah, if we are not able to do both for every prayer, then at least we should try to do the iqamah for every prayer and do the adhan for Fajr and perform the adhan for Maghrib. There are benefits that come, of course, spiritually. There are benefits that will come to anybody who will hear the sound of the adhan and the iqamah, but there is also a benefit which will come even in a worldly sense in terms of our health and our well-being and our families and our offspring. So this is preparation for the salat. Now, in the prayer, one of the actions that we do is we go into ruku'. And ruku' is considered to be a rukn of prayer. It is especially important if there is a mistake made in a rukn, if there is a mistake made in the ruku', for example, then the prayer cannot be rectified. For example, if you are joining a congregation, if you miss the takbiratul ihram of the imam and you come in after that time, then you can join the prayer. If you miss the qira'ah of Surah Fatiha, you can still join the jama'at. If you miss the second surah, you can still join the congregation. But if you miss the ruku', then you have missed that cycle of the prayer. So it is an essential part of the prayer. And it's important for us to give importance to the ruku' and to the sujood, and to do them properly. In many different ahadith, when we are told about how to use salat in order to approach Allah and ask Him for our needs. The Imams have mentioned that, for example, man salla rak'atayn fa'atamma ruku'ahuma wa sujudahuma, who does 2 rak'at prayer and does the ruku' and the sujood completely and properly and in a dignified manner. That is a person who has done a proper 2 rak'ats of prayer and who then will have his dua or his hajat answered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are ahadith that tell us that the Prophet, when he would do his prayers, especially the nafilah prayers, he would make an effort to keep a balance in his salat. And that balance is such that his qiyam before ruku' and his ruku' and his sujood would be about the same duration. And so, for example, in the nafilah, the Prophet would recite about 15 verses of Qur'an, 15 ayat of the Qur'an as his qira'at, and then his ruku' would be of that same duration, and his sujood would be of that same duration. And therefore, the prayer would be in a balanced form. Qira'at is an important part of the salat. Ruku' and sujood, they are also important parts of the salat mentioned in the Qur'an itself and in the ahadith. There is a hadith of our first Imam, Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam, which gives us something to think about when we go into ruku', and which reminds us of what the meaning of ruku' is, and it might help us concentrate better, and it might help us also be able to collect our thoughts better when we are praying. In general, we make an effort to be aware of what we are saying when we are praying. But for those of us who are not native speakers of Arabic and who don't know the language, that might not be sufficient for us to concentrate. So for me to know the translation of a particular dhikr that I recite, Subhana Rabbiyal Azim wa bihamdih, that might not be sufficient for me to have full presence of mind. But if we have an inclination of what the symbolism of our actions in salat are, that might be a little bit of an assistance in maintaining that concentration and that presence of mind. So this hadith and the hadith we will be looking at for sujood, they fulfill that role for us. The Imam said that the ta'wil of the ruku' is amantu billahi walau duribat unuqi, that I have faith in Allah and I will maintain my iman, even if it means that I have to give up my neck in the path of Allah. So ruku' is, in essence, a commitment that our iman, our faith, is more important to us than life itself. And if we are ever called, or if it is ever required for us to sacrifice our life, then we will bow down and we will willingly give our neck, we will willingly give our head, but we won't sacrifice our religion, we won't sacrifice our principles. And so ruku' is a reminder of that. And in salat, it is one of the beautiful aspects of our prayer that we do as Muslims, that we not only recite the Qur'an and words of praise and supplication to Allah, but we do so with different movements. Those movements are not just symbolic, but if you think about it, they are movements of an increasing vulnerability. So when I stand up and I then bow down, I am more vulnerable than when I'm standing up. I can't see what is going on in front of me. And then I stand up, and then I go into a position of even greater vulnerability. In fact, probably the most vulnerable position that you can put yourself in as a human being. When you go into prostration, sujood is basically a symbolic recognition that we are entirely at the mercy of Allah. We are fully vulnerable. We might not feel vulnerable when we are standing up, and when we have something in our hands, we might feel very powerful. We might feel at the top of our game. But in reality, creationally, existentially, we are always entirely vulnerable, entirely at the mercy of Allah. So there is a very special significance to sujood, even more so than ruku', in reminding us that at all moments in our life, we are that vulnerable, and we are entirely at the mercy of Allah. Sujood is the best reminder of that. And that is why we have many different ahadith which say that أَقْرَبُ مَا يَكُونُ الْعَبْدُ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهِ وَهُوَ سَاجِدٌ. The very closest that you can get to your Lord is when you are in a state of sujood and in a state of prostration. That is the very closest. It is not difficult, it is not inaccessible, it is something that any one of us, we can do at any moment. We can approach Allah and get as close as humanly possible to Him by going into prostration. And there are several things that we should bear in mind with regard to our prostration in salat and outside of salat. There is a hadith of our Prophet Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, in which he was answering the question of somebody who said that, O Messenger of Allah, pray to me to be worthy of your intercession in the hereafter. Or somebody would come to the Prophet perhaps and see the Prophet was taking care of some of his affairs and would say, Ya Rasulullah, let me take care of it. Don't burden yourself. And the Prophet would say that, no, I will take care of my own responsibilities. And then that person might say to the Prophet that, Ya Rasulullah, give me the opportunity to have some reward, some benefit, or pray to Allah that He will make me worthy of Jannah, or that I can be worthy of Jannah. And in several such incidences, when people came to the Prophet, they said that, make that dua that we will be worthy of your intercession. Make that dua that we will be worthy of paradise. Now, somebody who comes to the Prophet with that supplication and that hope, that indicates a level of sincerity. And the Prophet would respond that I will make that dua, وَلَكِنْ أَعِنِّي بِكَثْرَةِ السُّجُودِ, or أَعِنَّا بِطُولِ السُّجُودِ, that you need to help me. I will make the dua. But even though it is the Prophet making the dua, a Prophet whose prayers are never rejected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet is saying that here I am going to need some of your assistance. You can ask the Prophet for his intercession and he will give the intercession. You can ask the Prophet for his prayer to help a person get to paradise. But the Prophet says that there is something that you will need to do as well. And that is kathratus sujud and tulus sujud, two things. One is to frequently go into prostration, and one is to lengthen the prostration. That can be done inside our salat or outside of salat. So it is sujud if we do that sujud by performing our nawafil regularly, for example. So each of those nawafil will have sujud in it. Or it can be outside of our prayer, and we will talk about some of those dimensions of sujud outside of prayer in addition to during our prayer. But before we do that, let us look at one hadith of Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam. It is a very beautiful hadith in which he describes the meaning of sujud. What should we be thinking about when we are going into prostration? And in this hadith, the Imam is referencing a verse of Surah Taha, verse number 55 of Surah Taha. And in that verse, Allah says that, addressing the humanity, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, minha khalaqnakum wa fiha nu'idukum wa minha nukhrijukum taratan ukhra. That, O humanity, we have created you from the earth, and it is into the earth that we will put you back, we will return you to it, and then we will take you out of the earth once again. Imam Ali says that this is the symbolism of sujud. That the first prostration is a recognition from a person, as if we are saying, Allahumma innaka minha khalaqtana. That, oh Allah, you created us from the earth. So when we are going into prostration, we are recognizing that our origin, it is from the earth. And that is one reason why it is very highly recommended to prostrate not just on something natural. Right? According to many Muslims, you can prostrate on whatever surface you are standing on. So if it's a synthetic carpet, for example, or a synthetic floor, then many Muslims will say that's fine, you can prostrate on it. According to the followers of Ahlul Bayt and according to the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, we only prostrate on something which is of the earth, which is natural, and which is not used for food and not used for clothing. So you won't prostrate on cotton, for example. We won't prostrate on a lettuce leaf that is consumed. That is a reminder of our humility and a reminder of the reason why we go into prostration in the first place. But out of all of those natural things, the very best thing to prostrate on is the earth itself. So it's fine to prostrate on a stone. It is fine to prostrate on a piece of wood if it's unfinished or unpolished. But the very best thing is to prostrate on earth, because then when we lift up our head from the sujood, we will have some of those specks of dust on our forehead. And it's also recommended to put the tip of the nose on the ground and to have that dust on the nose as well. That doesn't mean that the prayer has been done wrong. If you see somebody who has done sujood and they have some specks of dust on their forehead, that's not something to be embarrassed about. That is the very purpose of sujood in the first place. So the Imam says that the first sujood, we should be thinking about the affirmation to Allah that Allahumma minha khalaqtana. You have created us from the earth. And then when we lift up our head from sujood, وَمِنْهَا أَخْرَجْتَنَا, that it is from the earth that you have given us life. You have taken us out from the earth. Then when we go into the second sajda, the second prostration, that is an affirmation from us that Allah, you will return us to the earth. We will die. And our time on this earth will come to an end. But it is a continuous transition, just as our prayer is a continuous transition from one state to another, so that death is not something that we fear. We are symbolizing it in every prayer numerous times. In each cycle of prayer, we are symbolizing our birth and our life in this earth, and then we are symbolizing the second sujood, or the second sajda, is wa fiha tu'iduna, and it is in the earth that you will return us. And then when we sit up from the second sajda, then we are affirming to Allah that you will take us out from the earth once again, and we will stand to account for our actions. So in every cycle of prayer, we are symbolically with our actions and with our words, we are affirming the entire cycle of life. It is something which is a very powerful message. In fact, it is just as powerful as trying to concentrate on the words that we are reciting. And when we understand that symbolism, we can also appreciate the method in which we are to perform sujood as well. So between the two sujood, what is required is that you sit still for just a moment between the two sajdas, between each of the two prostrations. But it is recommended to do istighfar at that time, because that is what our life should be. Remembering Allah and seeking forgiveness for whatever shortcomings are natural and are unavoidable because of our existence in this material plane. And then when we go into the second sajda, and then we come up from the second sajda, here again, those of you who may have participated in a jama'at that is not a Shi'i jama'at, you may have noticed that many Muslims, when they come up from the second sajda, they don't sit up. They immediately go into a standing position. And that is something that our imams have said is not the proper way to do the prayer. It is against the dignity of the prayer. And that jalsatul istiraha, sitting down after the second sajda and then standing up from a sitting position, that is the correct practice of the Prophet and the imams. And there is a historical reason why that change was brought about. But that sitting up from the second sajda, that is an affirmation and a reminder to us of the resurrection, that we will be brought back to life after we have been returned to the earth. And so it is worthy for us to sit and to pause. That is in the first rak'ah and in, for example, the third rak'ah of a 4 rak'ah prayer. Of course, if it is a rak'ah when we will be reciting tashahhud, then we will pause after the second sajda and we will recite tashahhud. So the difference between prayer as taught by Ahlul Bayt rahimahus-salatu was-salam and as is practiced by some of the other schools of law, it also becomes a bit more clear and more meaningful for us if we understand some of the things that are the wisdom behind our acts of worship. Sujood is an entire act of worship in and of itself, and the two sujuds, the two sajdas, which comprise sujood, and sitting up after each of them, that is a symbol of the cycle of life. Please recite salawat. One other sajda which is very highly recommended is to do a prostration whenever we remember a favor that Allah has given us. We are all familiar with the phrase sajdatul shukr, the prostration of gratitude. that is something that was practiced by the Prophet and by the Imams, and it would be done whenever there is a favor that Allah gave us, or whenever we remember a favor that we may have been given before. And one time when we are especially going to be able to see some of those divine favors is when we travel outside of our day-to-day routine. So if we travel, we should see many people who are suffering tests that Allah has kept us safe from, whether it be in their person, in their families, in their material life, in their health. Whenever we remember a favor that Allah has given us, some hardship that He has protected us from, it is recommended for us to do sajda and to affirm that gratitude. Now, the gratitude has to come from within the heart. So simply to say shukran lillah is not enough. But when we make that commitment to go into sujood and to actively establish that we are grateful to Allah, it makes it easier for us to translate the verbal gratitude into a gratitude that is reflected in our actions. There is a hadith of our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salatu was-salam, that is about sajdat al-shukr, and sajdat al-shukr is a sajda that should be done both by putting the forehead on the ground, by doing a sajda, and also then it is recommended to put each of the two cheeks on the ground. That is a further symbol of humility and gratitude to Allah. The Imam says that إِذَا ذَكَرَ أَحَدُكُمْ نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى فَلْيَضَعْ خَدَّهُ عَلَى التُّرَابِ. Put your cheek on the dust or on the dirt whenever you remember a ni'mah, a blessing that Allah has given you. وَإِن لَمْ يَكُنْ يَقْدِرُ عَلَى النُّزُولِ لِلشُّهْرَةِ. There might be times though, especially if you are out and about and you remember something that Allah has given you as a favor, when you won't be able to do sujood. At the very least, because it might be something that people would say you are doing to show off. Shuhra means that it will make you mashhur, it will make you someone that people will point out by their fingers. So if you're not able to do sujood, then فَلْيَضَعْ خَدَّهُ عَلَى قُرْبُوسِهِ. Then if you have a saddle, for example, if you are traveling, you can put your head on the dashboard or on the saddle. And if you are not able to do that as well, فَإِنْ لَمْ يَقْدِرْ فَلْيَضَعْ خَدَّهُ عَلَى كَفِّهِ ثُمَّ لْيَحْمَدِ اللَّهَ عَلَى مَا أَنْعَمَ عَلَيْهِ. If you are not able to do that as well, then the type of sajdat al-shukr that we can do when we are out and about is to put our forehead in our palm and then to symbolically do a sujood and to praise Allah, do hamd of Allah, and thank Him from our hearts for what favors He has given us. If we make this a habit of saying shukr to Allah whenever we see a favor, whenever we remember a favor, and if we do that sajdat al-shukr as a matter of course in our life, and if we're not able to actually go into prostration, to do so symbolically, then that is probably one of the best medicines that we can have from ever getting down and getting the blues or becoming depressed. Because we will always remember all of those things that we have been given by Allah, and we will affirm our gratitude for it. The importance of sajdat al-shukr in a general sense is also one reason why it is important when we are completing a prayer. There is a hadith that the reason why sajdat al-shukr is so highly recommended after your salat is because your salat represents tawfiq that Allah has given you. He is the one who guided your heart to be able to do the salat. There are many people who are Muslim in name, but they can't bring themselves to perform their prayers. There is something deficient in that person's heart and in that person's soul. If He has guided me to perform my prayer, and to do so on time, and to do so correctly, and especially if He has guided me and given me the ability to do that prayer in a congregation and in a masjid, then that is something that I should show gratitude to Allah for. That one step of doing sajdat al-shukr after our prayer and saying, thank you Allah for letting me say this prayer, is probably one of the things that can best protect us against arrogance. Because a person who does sajdat al-shukr for having been given the opportunity to prayer is never a person who is going to hold up his prayers or her prayers to Allah and say, look at how much I have done, and have I gotten the results that I would expect in this world. So it is an insurance policy against arrogance. And the minimum that we have been told when you do sajdatul shukr after your salat is to say shukran lillah 3 times. Beyond that is recommended and it is good, but at the very least to say shukran lillah 3 times. So these are some of the acts of prayer. In the interest of time, we will move on. We also have other ta'qibat which are recommended for us after the prayer. And the ta'qibat of the prayer, those things that come after the prayer, they are very, very important. And we should give some recognition to the importance of ta'qibat. We will talk about what are the most important of them. The very most important are 2. Tasbih of Fatima Zahra salamullahi alayha. And the dua. In fact, it has been said in numerous ahadith that if you are limited in time, if you are pressed for time, then to do tasbih and to do dua is better than to do nafilah. To do a recommended prayer that is not as important and as good as to perform the dhikr of Fatima Zahra salamullahi alayha and to do dua. 2 things are mentioned in the Quran, and it is said that the tasbih of Fatima Zahra is the fulfillment of these 2 verses of Quran. One is the verse in Surah Al-Ahzab in which Allah says, "Udhkurullaha dhikran kathira." Remember Allah a frequent remembrance. So the Prophet said that frequent remembrance is fulfilled by performing tasbih Fatima Zahra after every prayer. And the other is the verse of Surah Al-Baqarah which says, "Udhkuruni adhkurkum," remember me and I will remember you. This dhikr also is said to be dhikr of Fatima Zahra. If a person does tasbih, then it fulfills that divine call that remember me, mention me, and I will mention you. So there are 2 benefits, especially for tasbih of Fatima Zahra salamullahi alayha. With regard to spending some time after our prayer in dhikr, in dua, just a few hadith that can give us a motivation to do that with more regularity and more presence of mind. One is a hadith of our 6th Imam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. He says that إِنَّ اللَّهَ فَرَضَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصَّلَوَاتِ الْخَمْسَ فِي أَفْضَلِ السَّاعَاتِ فَعَلَيْكُمْ بِالدُّعَاءِ فِي أَدْبَارِ الصَّلَوَاتِ. That Allah chose the times of your prayers to be the very best times when His gates of mercy are open to humanity. So choose that time to make your dua to Allah. If you have a need that you have to ask Allah for, if you need to ask forgiveness for something that you have done, if you have something that is worrying you about the future, you can pray to Allah at any time. But the best times for dua are the times that Allah has given us and taught us to do our 5 daily prayers. There is a reason why our prayers have been legislated at specific times. It wasn't just by coincidence. And so that is the best time for us to do our own individual prayers and our own ta'qibat. And then there is a hadith which is narrated by the 6th Imam when he quoted his father, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam. He says that my father used to give a tafsir of the final verse of Surah Alam Nashrah Laka Sadrak. The 2 verses which say, فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ وَإِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَارْغَبْ. Imam Baqir would interpret or would explain this verse by saying that إِذَا قَضَيْتَ الصَّلَاةَ بَعْدَ أَن تُسَلِّمْ وَأَنْتَ جَالِسٌ فَانْصَبْ فِي الدُّعَاءِ مِنْ أَمْرِ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ مِنَ الدُّعَاءِ فَارْغَبْ إِلَى اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ أَنْ يَتَقَبَّلَهَا مِنْكَ. The last 2 verses of Surah Alam Nashrah Laka Sadrak, they say that فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ وَإِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَارْغَبْ. That when you are finished with something, then exert yourself and have high hopes and a great deal of hope and trust in Allah. Now that is a general principle in our life. It's very common for us to rest on our laurels. If I accomplish something, if you go to a student who has just finished the last day of school, what are your plans? Generally, it's going to be, I'm going to recover from having been in school for the last 10 months or however long it's been. I'm going to not think about anything for some time. If you just finished a difficult exam, then you have that time when you want to throw up your hands and relax. Many of us, the weekend are that time to not think about anything, at least for the beginning of the weekend. But the instruction that we have in the Quran, فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ, as soon as you have completed one thing, then put yourself into exertion. Give importance now to setting another goal. Don't just rest on your laurels, because then you will lose the momentum that you might have acquired. Give yourself a time to relax. Give yourself a time for leisure, but put that as part of your schedule. When you have accomplished one goal, then immediately start thinking about what your next goal is and start working towards it. And that also applies to our salat. Imam Baqir says that when you have finished one prayer, then immediately exert yourself in dua after that prayer. And then once you have exerted yourself after the prayer in dua, وَإِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَارْغَب, then have high hopes that Allah will accept your dua and your salat from you. So there is a general principle that we have in these verses, and then a specific application to our salat and for our ta'qibat. So now let us look at a few of our recommended prayers. Just very briefly, we all know that the night prayer is recommended. It is one of our daily nawafil. It is mentioned in the Quran. There are ahadith that it was a requirement from the Prophet and a requirement from previous prophets, but for the believers it is an option, but it is very highly recommended. It has benefits for our worldly life, for our rizq, for, it is said, the nur of a believer's face, and also for a person's spiritual advancement in the hereafter. Many of our ulama have said, in addition to the ahadith that we have from the imams, that any success that we have achieved spiritually and religiously in our lives, it is because of Salatul Layl. This can be done in a way which is not difficult for us. So it is 11 rak'ats, but you can pray 3 rak'ats, shaf' and witr, and that is sufficient to perform Salatul Layl. It can be done from midnight until Fajr time, but if a person is traveling, if a person is sick, or if they are afraid that they might not be able to do so, then you have 2 options. You can perform Salatul Layl before midnight, at the beginning of the night, and you can make the qadha, make it up afterwards. Out of the 2, it is better to try to wake up, and then if we don't wake up, to make it up afterwards. There is a hadith from our 6th Imam where he says that it's better for you to make it up afterwards, because if you pray it early, then it's liable to become a habit, where you will then just make a habitual pattern of praying Salatul Layl and then going to sleep. Try to wake up, and if you end up not waking up, then you can make up the prayer afterwards. And one other prayer that I would like to mention is Salatul Istikhara, because Istikhara is something that all of us are familiar with and many of us do repeatedly. The very best form of Istikhara is Salatul Istikhara, and that is to do wudu and to do a 2 rak'at prayer with full presence of mind, and then during that prayer to ask Allah to do what is best for us. And ahadith say that after you perform that prayer, during the prayer or whatever comes to your mind after the prayer, and whichever direction your heart leans, then take that course of action. Or if you need to get some advice, if you have to do mashwara, then do that consultation after you have done Salatul Istikhara. So you don't need to do the Istikhara by looking for a verse of Quran or by looking at the beads of tasbih. Salatul Istikhara is to perform a 2 rak'at prayer and then to say to Allah that I need to make this decision, so guide me to make the best decision. And then trust that what we have thought will be something that Allah will complete for us. If we need to get advice, we can get advice. There is a hadith which says that the furthest time that shaitan is from you and the most unable that he will ever be to tempt you and to misguide you is when you are in salat. So when you do Salatul Istikhara, in a sense you are removing shaitan from your presence. And then if something comes into your mind at that time, have enough tawakkul in Allah to take that step and to trust that Allah will give you the best result. These are a few of our instructions with regard to salat, and it is now time for Salatul Maghrib. May Allah accept our worship, our prayers, and our fasting, and answer our du'as. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us the best of this life and the best of the hereafter. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.